As we look at our third section of the book of Leviticus, we're really looking at priesthood and how Aaron and his sons were consecrated to the priesthood and what that means. Priesthood is an interesting word for us today. I often tell people I am not a minister, I am a priest, and yet people often come into the church and say, "Are you the priest here?" It might be interesting to ask, what do we mean by the word priest? What is it? Under the old covenant, God's people had a priesthood. Under the new covenant, all of God's people are called to be the priests. Every believer in Jesus Christ, according to John, is a priest. Perhaps we've all too often reduced the idea of calling to being called to professional ministry, when actually all of us are called, if we're God's people, to be priests and to serve him. So Leviticus 8 to 10 describes what would be an 8-day ordination ceremony for the high priest Aaron and his sons. As God's chosen priests, they had to accept three things, three responsibilities. Number one, they had to submit to God's authority. That was in chapter 8. In number 9, they are to reveal God's glory. And in chapter 10, they're to accept God's discipline. Submitting to God's authority has always been hard for humanity, right back to the Garden of Eden, because we always like to think that we know best. And hindsight tells us that we don't know best, that God knows best. So there were specific rules set out as to how this was to happen. In verses 1 to 5, the whole assembly was called. It had been impossible for all the people to assemble at one time at the door, so it's probably the elders and the leaders gathered as a representation of the people, because it was a serious thing to be set apart to this role of priest in God's kingdom. So in verse 6, they washed. They were washed all over once, and then from then on they washed their hands and their feet. Then they were clothed in special garments. Aaron got linen undergarments, and his sons also had some lovely garments as well. And remember, on the front of the high priest's garment, he wore a linen turban with a special golden crown. At the front of it were written these words, "Holy to the Lord." So then Aaron and the tabernacle were anointed in verses 10 to 12. This was done with a special oil. His sons were clothed in verse 13. And in verse 14 to 29, various sacrifices were offered. The bullock for the sin offering, a ram for the burnt offering, and the blood of the sin offering was put on the altar. One of the things that perhaps we struggle with is the fact it was necessary that blood should be shed before God could accept Aaron and his sons. This has always been God's way. The Bible says there is no forgiveness of sins without the shedding of blood. So right at the end, there's the ordination ram eaten. So for the week, Aaron and his sons had to remain in the tabernacle court. Each day, Moses offered sacrifices, and the priests ate the meat of the ram of ordination. They were not permitted to eat this meat on the next day. It had to be that day's. Had they disobeyed these instructions and left the tabernacle, they would have died. The Bible is quite clear that it's a serious thing to be one of God's priests. In chapter 9, they're called to reveal God's glory. So they're sacrificing on God's altar in verses 1 to 21. And each day, this happened every morning and every evening, because each day must begin and end with total dedication to the God. The fact that they were ordained meant that they were set apart to offer sacrifices for the people. And we talked about all those different sacrifices last week. And these would have been the ones that they were now offering in place of Moses, who had fulfilled this role before. There must have been a huge fire taking up all these offerings. This must have given the people some assurance that God was with them. Indeed, Hebrews 12 describes God as a burning fire, and the fire could have consumed all of the people. The third thing they're called to do is accept God's discipline. Sadly, this day, which should have been a glorious day, ended with the funeral of two of Aaron's sons. Nadab and Abihu, everything they did was wrong. If you read, I have a little list here. They were the wrong people to be handling the incense. It was their father's job. They used the wrong instruments. They used their own censers. They acted at the wrong time. They acted under the wrong authority. They didn't follow God's instructions. They used the wrong fire. And so it goes on with how they do things from them. And it may seem strange to us that God killed them instead of merely warning them. But that was the way it was. They followed God's instructions, or else disaster came. It wasn't enough for the priests to teach the people the difference between holy and unholy. They also had to practice it in their own lives. The Bible says it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Perhaps this is what the Bible is referring about, being God's priests. And perhaps some of the things that Aaron and his sons were called to are the very things that we are called to as God's people today. I hope we can find a few things to talk about.